The house smelled like lemon cleaner and old money. Portraits of ancestors with severe jaws and severe opinions lined the stairwell. In the living room, the piano gleamed with the same polished perfection as my parents' smiles, immaculate, brittle, and performative. This was the stage where everything in our family was weighed and measured by appearances. Love was a ledger item, loyalty a line on a balance sheet. My name is Ethan Mercer. Birth certificate, DNA test, and all that boring bureaucratic proof sat comfortably in my chest. My brother, Caleb. Adopted at 9, golden smiles, uncanny charm, the kind of person who could make a barista write his name without him asking. To the world, he was our family's darling charity case. To my parents, he was the perfect cocktail of tragedy and PR. To me, he was a lying parasite who had crawled into the center of our lives and eaten the heart out of our family's attention. It didn't happen overnight. First it was hesitations. My father's, "It's just that Caleb needs more support right now." My mother's distant consolation at my high school play. Then it became explicit. They chose to reallocate the trust fund money earmarked for my college toward Caleb's tuition and therapeutic needs. When I challenged them, they called it making sacrifices for a child with fewer opportunities. They spoke the language of nobles and benefactors, and it slid easily past their conscience. The last straw came one stormy night when, after another conversation that felt like a firing squad, my father told me in clipped, precise tones that I would be assisting Caleb with his SATs. He used the word as if handing me a chore list: pick up milk, help Caleb. The implication was a threat: disobey and I was to be disowned. "We saved him," my mother would say later, eyes glittering with the righteous sheen of the sanctimonious. "He's family." What they meant when they said family was not genetic. It meant good optics. It meant a narrative they could feed to donors and boards. It meant a public story about the Mercer family's magnanimity. They saw me as a convenient instrument, someone competent, disciplined, and invisible. They underestimated the furnace of quiet rage that had been building inside me since childhood. They underestimated my refusal to be the convenient stepping stone in someone else's fairy tale. So when the order came, "Help Caleb cheat," I did what they expected. I nodded. I agreed. I promised to help. But I also promised myself something else. I would not ruin my future. I would not be a pawn. I would turn their demand into the raw materials of my revenge. Inside my room I began to plan, not in the clumsy cinematic sense of midnight monologues and stabbing newspapers, rather in the methodical, clinical way of someone who had always been a scholar. I had been top of my class since elementary school. I devoured problems like others devoured shows, and logic comforted me. The SAT was a logistics puzzle. If Caleb was going to be a fraud, I would become the measurement that proved it. "High IQ revenge," I said the phrase aloud once, feeling its shape. It felt accurate and infinitely satisfying. They wanted me to be a hand. I would be a hammer. I started small. I revised my schedule to create time for both of them, tutoring sessions that would masquerade as assistants, evenings at the table reviewing math practice tests, weekends at the library with my head bowed over books. I let my parents see me bending toward Caleb in the way they wanted. I smoothed my face and took on the role of the dutiful son. But under that role, my machine turned. I sketched out a plan that aimed to achieve two outcomes simultaneously: to raise my own SAT score to something so blindingly high that it made cheating look petty, and to expose Caleb by making his miracle number mathematically, statistically, and ethically implausible. I found a way to reconcile the two aims. I would coach Caleb enough so his facade looked convincing, just convincing enough to make the required proofs plausible to anyone who performed only a cursory check. And I would outstrip him so completely that a comparison would feel like a public execution. This was not about petty humiliation. It was about reclaiming my trajectory. I had been told my future could be held hostage. I would instead seize the remote. On paper, my plan looked ridiculous. On paper, Caleb had no reason to be capable of anything like what my parents were pushing him to achieve. But paper had never been our family's strongest witness. Performance had weight. Media had weight. Appearances had weight. The way to make the truth stick was to weaponize the very thing my parents worshipped: proof. I started to write my own. I composed practice reports, tracked progress, created documents that showed methodical improvement. I registered for every available practice exam. I read guides, devoured advanced practice problems, and reconstructed every section of the SAT in my head so that I could teach it, manipulate it, and, if necessary, outwit it. I rebuilt my life around the scoreboard. I was careful. I played the dutiful son in public. I listened when my father lectured about optics and mergers, when my mother explained the responsibility of privilege. I volunteered with Caleb in the ways they wanted: photo ops, donor coffees, and community talks. I smiled in the right places and let the bitterness of their favoritism remain locked behind my teeth. But for every public charade, there was private preparation. On late nights, I stayed in the library until the lights dimmed, letting practice tests bleed into each other. I analyzed wrong answers like crime scene evidence. I wrote simulated essays and read them aloud into my phone, training my voice not to wobble when it needed to be steady. This will be your proof, I told myself. This will be your ticket. I didn't tell anyone about the part of my plan that felt the most dangerous, the most audacious. I intended to break the story arc my family had written by becoming a better version of what they thought they were creating for Caleb. I would become the inconvenient genius. At night, before sleep took me, I imagined two future headlines. One where Caleb's mystical score-boosting system made him receive public adoration, donors, and parental pats on the back. And one where my name was the one that appeared above the fold, the new state record holder, accepted at MIT and packing my bags while my family watched the spectacle of their chosen son undone. Both headlines fed my resolve. Revenge, I realized, could be academic. It could be strategic. It could be the kind that no one saw coming, quiet, escalating, inevitable. And as the storm outside our house swelled and receded, I sat at my desk, humming with a dangerous kind of calm, and prepared to turn the scales. The Mercer house turned small acts into public theater. Family dinners became rehearsed scenes. Conversations happened in 3 acts: the opening where they pretended to be interested, the middle where they made judgments in the softest of voices, and the curtain call when donations were scheduled and reputations polished. My role had been relegated steadily to the understudy, competent, invisible, convenient. Caleb was the star. His score-boosting system was nebulous, draped in mystery the way cult leaders wrap their promises in exotic-sounding jargon. In private, he called it a method when he wanted to sound serious. When he wanted to manipulate, he used a different word: miracle. My parents bought both words like they were antiques: rare, priceless, and presumed valuable. When they asked me to help, they framed it as both charity and obligation. The legal guardian voice chirped in a way that left no room for dissent. "We gave him a home," my mother told me once in a tone that bled sanctimony. "Now you'll help him get a future." Her hand hovered over a family document, as if signed consent on paper made moral absolution unnecessary. "We did what we could for him," she continued, confident that sentiment could absolve any conscience. I agreed, and I meant it, but I meant something different by the word help. My help would be a Trojan horse. I would appear to be teaching, but every measure of instruction would have a second purpose: to sharpen my knowledge and to test the limits of Caleb's system. The system itself was strange. It was a mixture of rituals, obscure mnemonics, and a quasi-technological aura he cultivated. Caleb's friends whispered about the sessions: intensive slogs in which algebra and verbal analogies dissolved into long, hypnotic recollections of childhood trauma, followed by cryptic memory hacks. He kept a black binder with handwritten notes and claimed they were privileged insights gleaned from a mastermind coach. My parents talked about holistic approaches and psychological restructuring. Donors were told it was about resilience training. On the first evening I was asked to sit in on a session, Caleb arranged the living room like a sermon. Candles, aesthetic, not aromatic, a circle of cushions, and an old laptop with a PowerPoint that looked like it had been designed by someone who wanted to appear both cutting-edge and secretive. He watched me as if I were both a rival and a stage prop. "You'll see," he said, wide-eyed. "It's not cheating. It's harnessing latent potential. It's a technique." The technique, as far as I could tell, boiled down to rote memorization combined with theatrical narrative framing. Repeat an idea, assign it a personal story, create emotional hooks. Memory palaces dressed in trauma. It wasn't impossible. It wasn't impossible that someone could use this to improve recall. But the miraculous claims, accelerating someone of zero foundation to an SAT titan, felt like alchemy. "Let me watch," I said. I wanted to know how deep the con ran. If it was smoke and mirrors, I needed to strip it away. If there was an actual method, I needed to steal it. Both outcomes served me. Caleb's sessions had two stages: the soothing stage where you were made to feel seen, and the directive stage where you were given lists of cheat codes and odd mnemonic devices. There were bizarre rituals: wear these glasses, breathe this way, listen while reciting your trauma, mixed with legitimate test-taking strategies I recognized. Process of elimination, packing, and the structure of logical reasoning. It was as if Caleb had harvested a patchwork of real technique and woven it into a myth. My parents bought it. Donors believed it. Caleb paraded the method at charity events and in between champagne flutes. His charm softened questions like warm butter. I sat through the sessions, pretending to be an earnest helper, but I took notes. Real notes, not the performative ones Caleb assumed were there to bolster his cult-like aura. I cataloged the genuine strategies, the ones an actual teacher would use, and separated them from the theatrics. I simulated the memory palaces myself and found some utility in the emotional hooks. Emotion does help memory. But the more I observed, the more I saw the scaffolding of a con. The twist was how deftly Caleb had weaponized our parents' weaknesses. He knew precisely which buttons to push. The halo effect, adopted children are vulnerable. The family narrative, we must rescue them. And the vanity of philanthropic optics. He crafted a story so compelling that people stopped looking for hard evidence. In our circles, narrative trumped proof. If I wanted to expose him publicly, I needed something beyond narrative. I needed an implausibility so glaring it couldn't be gaslit away. I needed a number that tripped the scales of believability. So I decided to do two things in parallel. First, I would tutor Caleb on the real, technical elements of the SAT that required foundational knowledge, math fluency, vocabulary in context, logical reasoning, enough that he could plausibly answer questions when observed. Second, I would set my own practice routine to achieve an unprecedented score, not just top of state, something that made gossip die and investigations begin. I would make the numbers the kind of evidence that couldn't be ignored. My secret weapon wasn't cheating, it was mastery. I studied parts of the test until patterns stopped being puzzles and became muscle memory. I strained to be the kind of student who didn't just know answers, who could reconstruct the test's architecture in his head. If the SAT was a machine, I wanted to be its engineer. Meanwhile, I let Caleb believe he was gaining ground. I fed him practice prompts, walked him through process of elimination, taught him how to manage time. I allowed him to perform as he wanted in family settings. He soaked up the attention like oil. Under the surface, a different thing was happening. I began to engineer plausible performance gaps, moments where Caleb could succeed just enough to be convincing, but not so much as to outstrip me. I simulated practice exams where his score rose in carefully controlled increments that would please our parents and donors without making statisticians sniff around. There was another layer: documentation. I recorded practice test results in a ledger only I could access. I documented my own progress in exhaustive detail. I kept copies of practice tests, timed sections, and annotated errors. My objective was to create a mountain of credible data to back my eventual claim to superior ability. They would bank their faith on my diligence. In time, the mountain would be used to bury the myth. If my parents wanted a miracle, let them have one for a while. When the world looked closer, my evidence would be precise, reproducible, and devastating. I did not believe in theatrical exposures. I believed in incontrovertible proof. At night, while Caleb rehearsed his lines and practiced his mystic breathing, I sat with my notes, calculating the statistical odds of someone with his background mapping onto the scores his system boasted. I ran the numbers again and again. Some results demanded investigation. Others demanded a different weapon, a score that looked absurdly human in its excellence. So I began to aim for impossible competence, not for revenge that was loud and petty, but for one that would be heard by the right ears: journalists, admissions officers, the boardrooms that controlled my family's world. I would make my parents' chosen narrative collapse under the gravity of my achievement. Revenge, it seemed, had a blueprint, and blueprints, unlike theater, could not be altered in the middle of a performance. Rooms become maps if you're smart enough. The Mercer Library, with its oak shelves and donor plaques, became my training ground. I bought stacks of practice books and set up timers like clocks in a gallery. You can read until your eyes ache, they say, but the SAT, like any machine, demands apprenticeship. You do thousands of small, precise motions until your hands know the shape of the task. My social life dissolved the way sugar dissolves in hot coffee. Friends texted and I answered with delays. Promises were rescheduled. My father smiled at my dedication and assumed I was being molded into a reliable asset. My mother called me a pillar at a board meeting once and felt satisfied. They didn't see the hunger beneath the discipline, how every practice test felt like a step toward exorcism. I charted my progress in red ink. Sections improved, timing sharpened. My endurance became uncanny. I kept practice tests in folders and annotated them obsessively. Why I missed a question, which heuristics misfired, what pattern of fatigue led my eyes to skip a line. It was boring and holy. Meanwhile, Caleb got his own tailored coaching, which I both supervised and manipulated. I taught him a handful of tricks that would function under observation. He learned to bluff, to speak with confidence, to create the impression of understanding. He got the songs and the dressings he needed for the performance. He was charismatic. He could charm an inspector into believing an empty theater was full. My parents watched both processes, proud and blind. "You're doing right by him," my father told me once, clapping my shoulder. He meant it as praise. I received it as a lie. The more they lauded him, the more precise my plan became. You can't break a story with a whisper, you break it with math. I added layers of strategy. I began cultivating relationships with teachers and guidance counselors, not to conspire but to understand. Guidance counselors have a way of describing students that is oddly predictive. They write the narratives that admissions offices see. I wrote to teachers with gratitude and requests for feedback. I asked for additional practice. I asked for letters of recommendation, honest ones, executed with the precision of someone who knew reputations matter. At the same time, I managed the optics at home. I performed exhaustion and dutifulness. I was the face of patience for Caleb's sessions. In public, I moderated my reactions. I let my parents bask in their magnanimity. I learned to smile as they told me that family first was a phrase to live by. Their version of family, apparently, involved knocking humility down like a prop. There were nights I wanted to scream. Not at Caleb. He was doing what he needed to survive in the ecosystem, and not at my parents, who had learned to see charity as a shield. My anger was a pale, cold thing made out of disappointment. I directed it into work. On practice test day, I went through rituals: black coffee, a specific playlist, classical, minor key, and a route to the test center that minimized variables. Punctuality mattered because control mattered. At night, after tests, I analyzed every mistake like a coroner. Errors revealed themselves as patterns. Patterns revealed themselves as opportunities. But even as I trained, the world complicated. Caleb's confidence rose. His public performances grew more dramatic, more self-aware. He developed a following among some donors who found his story irresistible. The more momentum he gained, the more my parents were seduced by the idea that they'd saved someone into greatness. I felt like an archaeologist uncovering a fraud, painstaking, meticulous, and utterly alone in the dig. Everyone else danced around the surface, satisfied with the shine. My evidence was quieter, graphs and practice test trajectories and annotated mistakes. When the time came to set my plan in motion, I would reveal not a scream but a dataset. A pivot happened when I discovered an oddity in Caleb's practice tests. He had a binder of supposedly private practice scores, produced for donors and as part of the narrative. The numbers were too clean, sudden leaps and disproportionate strengths in sections where he had historically performed poorly. I began to suspect fabrication. The binder's handwriting changed. The timestamps were implausible. You don't need auditors when your own intuition knows the sound of a lie. I began to create controlled experiments. I introduced deliberately difficult practice sections, then covertly timed him to see if his system would produce consistent improvements under stress. The results were messy. Sometimes he held his own. Sometimes he imploded. It was enough to show that there was no stable, miraculous method, just flashes of guile, mimicry, and luck. The most dangerous part was how my plan required me to stay intimately close to Caleb, to coach him, to appear to be invested in his success, while simultaneously cultivating the evidence to expose him. Maintaining that duality felt like spinning plates over an open flame. And then came the morality check. I had to decide what I would do if the exposure hurt him in ways that were catastrophic. I didn't want harm for harm's sake. My aim was to reclaim my life and the family business the only ethical way I could manage, by making truth unavoidable. I told myself a final truth in the library one night. This was not about revenge alone. If my parents were going to make decisions that destroyed my future to elevate a lie, I had the right to act. The mechanism for my act was excellence. So I trained until the SAT felt like an extension of my nervous system. I trained until my mock essays read like op-eds rather than attempts. I trained until my multiple-choice instincts were faster than my doubts. I trained until the scoreboard was not a terrifying unknown, but a language in which I was fluent. When the day came to take the official SAT, I would be calm. My life would depend on the result, and so would my plan. The idea of yielding my fate to a single test felt obscene and honest simultaneously. It was a cruel metric. It was also a vector. I tightened my backpack and made a second list, a list of contingencies should my parents retaliate. It was small, practical, a savings account in my name, a minimal contact list for people who could help me find lodging, an acceptance letter draft lined up. I was not naive. I knew my parents' power in the community, but power falters under objective proof. In that quiet inventory, I discovered the clearest part of my motivation. I wasn't angry about Caleb. I was furious at the way my parents had written over me. The SAT would be a scalpel, precise and cold. I would use it not to maim, but to rewrite the narrative. The weeks leading up to the test were a battlefield made of silence. I avoided social engagements, avoided family dinners that might require me to laugh at someone else's jokes. My parents watched me with a blend of pride and suspicion, pleased by my apparent sacrifice, but unconvinced of my motives. They couldn't see that sacrifice is sometimes a mask for a different kind of warfare. Caleb was buoyant. In the months of preparation, he learned the rhythms that made people adore him. He learned the right pauses. He learned how to speak about his struggles without seeming manipulative, leaning into vulnerability with skill. Donors flocked. The board sent invitations to speak. My parents' pride expanded. At home, the Mercers resembled a small empire tilting on an axis of sentimentality. They protected their narrative like a sacred relic. They were willing to rewiring the whole family's future to keep it glowing. I kept my head down. But war doesn't announce itself with clashes. It builds until the tension is so thick it snaps. There were small saboteurs, a smug smirk from my father in the hallway, a "we'll be so proud" from my mother when she folded linens, a camera flash when they surprised Caleb with a donor dinner. I cataloged each insult and converted it all into fuel. I also used it as a mirror to test my control. Could I remain composed when they treated me like a footnote? Then one afternoon, a new variable was introduced. Caleb's system began to attract attention beyond our social circle. A blogger, someone who fetishized unlikely success stories, wrote a piece about modern coaching methods and mentioned Caleb as a rising case study. The article was breathless and credulous, peppered with emotional quotes and staged photos. The internet is a place of echo chambers. Once the piece traveled, donors amplified it, and suddenly our family's home became a small studio for narrative reinforcement. My parents were thrilled. My father called to book interviews. My mother scheduled a podcast appearance. They wanted to set Caleb in the national imagination as the embodiment of philanthropic success. Their eyes glowed at the prospect of being the kind of family that rescues and then displays success. I hated it, and yet there was opportunity in the light. The larger the stage, the greater the exposure, and the easier it would be to break the narrative if I timed things correctly. I prepared for the inevitable media attention. I polished my own statements to be plainly factual. I wrote down how I would respond if asked about tutoring Caleb. I rehearsed answers that were non-accusatory but precise. If the world saw me speak calmly, measuredly, while Caleb performed theatrically, the dissonance might plant doubt. I also made an ironclad plan for the day results would be released. The SAT has its rituals, envelopes, scanned images, and a ceremony of numbers. Universities check for anomalies. They look for statistical oddities. They're not omniscient, but they have models. A 1633 out of 1600 should not exist. The moment such a number emerged, there would be systems that flagged it. That was my undercurrent of hope. To prepare, I built my evidence portfolio. Every practice test I'd taken was digitized. Timings, graphs, error logs, hex-coded charts, every bit of data was cataloged. I asked for letters of recommendation from 2 teachers who knew nothing of the family drama and would speak honestly about my intellectual curiosity. I refined my college essays into works that reflected both ambition and character. If the world wanted proof, I would furnish precision. I also prepared for the personal fallout. What happened if my parents disowned me the way they threatened? I had contingency funds hidden away, an offer from a roommate at a community near campus, and scholarships I'd applied for that would not evaporate overnight. Revenge, I told myself, also needed infrastructure. A week before results day, Caleb staged an event where he presented the system to a local school. Cameras, parents, and donors watched him deliver a speech about resilience. He praised the method and thanked my family repeatedly. My parents glowed. I sat in the back and clapped on cue. Inside, my engine purred. On the drive home that evening, my father spoke with the smug satisfaction of someone certain their story would live on. "This will open doors," he said. "You'll see." I tightened my fingers around the leather of my steering wheel and gave a noncommittal hum. I was not naive about destiny, but I had done all the work I could to create an outcome that would be undeniable. The only piece remaining was the test itself. Then 2 days before the results, the quietest betrayal happened. My father called a family meeting under the pretense of planning for Caleb's transition to university. He handed me a folder and told me to help prepare a schedule for Caleb's applications. It was the final confirmation of my role. I was being asked to smooth the way for the man who had occupied the center of my childhood. My throat closed. I accepted the folder and nodded. He believed I would help. He believed he had already won. The lie of the moment tasted metallic. I slid into the role and pretended to be helpful. I drafted lists for colleges for Caleb in block letters, highlighting options that would look charitable and prestigious. To my parents, it was a wedding gift. They'd married their public persona with a new success story. To me, it was a fuse. The launch stage was primed. The world would see both of us, Caleb on his stage and me in the background, the quiet geometry that would explode the whole performance. I slept poorly for the next 2 nights, rehearsing how I would answer questions, imagining the first headline. I tried to think of the emotional aftermath, but kept returning to spreadsheets and algorithms. Revenge is rarely cinematic. It is often administrative. It requires patience and proof, and the ability to breathe while every cell in your body wants to burst. In the small hours of the morning before results day, I arranged my evidence one last time. I placed my practice tests in order and ran another simulation. The numbers glowed like small embers. I felt a confidence that bordered on terror. If my score landed where I expected, my life would alter. If it didn't, I had to be ready to grieve and rebuild. Either way, I had already won something: clarity. I had chosen a path rather than letting the path be chosen for me. For all the cruelty that had shaped my family, I had found a kinder, clearer cruelty in the form of my own determination. The results were only the punctuation. It was the kind of early autumn morning where the light feels thin and decisive. I woke with a flat sense of inevitability, like the air had accepted that a judgment day had arrived and was impatient to get it over with. I dressed in clothes that felt neutral but professional, a quiet armor for whatever would come. My parents woke later, practiced their smiles for public life, cordial, proud, and slightly performative. Caleb slept in, its signals of nonchalance a brand he believed in. I ate the same breakfast I had eaten before every major test: toast, fruit, coffee. It was ritual, practical, and anonymous. There were no speeches. There was only the long, steady march of something poised to be decided. We drove together to the testing center, my parents insisting on accompanying Caleb for moral support and my own opportunity to be present but unobtrusive. The car smelled of cologne and high expectations. Everyone's posture was composed, rehearsed. Mine was smaller, focused. The testing center was a small civic building with institutional lighting. People filed in like bodies into a stadium of anonymity. I took a seat near the front because sitting toward the back felt like seeking refuge. I wanted to stare straight into whatever the day would show me. The test itself was an exercise in controlled calm. I had trained my body to settle into the rhythm of the exam. My breathing was slow, my eyes were spare. The math sections felt familiar. The reading passages were less dreamy than I had imagined. It was almost, dare I say, manageable. I didn't think of revenge while I worked. I thought of patterns and proofs. I thought of essays as arguments and multiple-choice questions as logic funnels. Each correct answer was a small suture sewing my future to its intended shape. When the exam ended, our family returned home. My parents prepared celebratory coffee, an early pat on the back for both sons regardless of the results they presumed were forthcoming. Caleb was buoyant. He had come to believe his own myth. My parents' joy made my stomach knot. We went about the rest of our day as a family in public ways. A short walk, a quiet dinner, polite conversations about the coming weeks. Inside me, something shifted into waiting. The results arena had not yet opened, but I felt its gravity like weather. The official release came 2 weeks later, an email that demanded attention as though it had weight. My hand shook when I opened it, a tiny tremor that felt absurd. I clicked. There it was. My score flashed on the screen like a datum in high relief. I sat back. The number was elegant in its cruelty. It was high, unimaginably high to anyone who knew me only as a quiet kid from a family that expected me to be serviceable. It was, for me, not the end but the confirmation of months of ruthless daily work. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. The impulse to post was fierce, but I held back. Context mattered. The proof mattered. Then came Caleb's result. When I saw it, my mouth went dry. I read and reread the digits on the screen. 1633/1600. I laughed first. not from joy but from a split second of complete disbelief. The number had the shape of a lie so brazen it was almost comic. You cannot earn 1633 on a 1600 scale. The arithmetic of it was absurd. I knew that the test machines and the people who processed results had a range of checks and balances. I also knew that when something this impossible appeared in the world, it would trigger systems to look closer. I felt my mother's hand on my shoulder. Her smile was wide and radiant. For a second it felt like being hit by two conflicting realities, my own private triumph and a public absurdity that would bend the room's reality. My chest ached, a strange cocktail of triumph and dread. It's difficult to describe what happens next, how the world rearranges itself when something impossible arrives. At first, the household celebrated. My mother tucked me into hugs that felt like small armatures around fragile truth. My father grinned, a grin that said we had the story we wanted. Caleb danced on the couch, levitating on his own narrative. Then the ripple arrived. A call from the school, a message from an admissions office asking for verification, an automated message from the SAT board flagged for anomaly review. The first sign that numbers have lives of their own is their ability to attract scrutiny when they defy the model. The 1633 was a beacon that would not go out. Our phones exploded. Reporters, people who had been at every donor event, reached out with breathless curiosity. Friends texted congratulations. Academics on social feeds speculated. And in the background, the test processors began a quiet procedural tightening. That evening, a camera crew arrived on our court for a feel-good local story about a local miracle. They wanted to film Caleb and ask about the system. They interviewed my parents in front of a designer bookshelf and asked me to sit quietly by and smile like decor. The world loved a narrative where the generous family raised a fallen child to triumph, and that was the story cameras wanted. During the interview, Caleb spoke with authority and practiced vulnerability. He looked like he had rehearsed his lines for the culture of pity and performance. When a local reporter turned to me and asked about my role, I answered precisely, factual, spare, and honest. I helped with practice sessions, I said. I tutored him in techniques that are useful for the SAT. I did multiple practice tests with him. They leaned into the spectacle. The live feed was edited for heartstring tugging. My father closed with a quip about resiliency and second chances. The segment wrapped, smiles all round. The internet liked miracles. But the anomaly could not be gilded indefinitely. A week after the broadcast, the college board, quietly and with protocol, commenced a statistical review of Caleb's score. To their credit, they did what they were supposed to do. Their system flagged his result and initiated a standard audit. Raw answer sheets, response patterns, timestamps, and matching to practice result signatures. What came after was a study in escalating incredulity. When auditors looked at Caleb's answer pattern, several things leapt out. His answers aligned with a frequency and pattern inconsistent with his previous history. There were long runs of statistically improbable correctness, response times that suggested not human packing but near-instantaneous selection, and a series of contradictions in his provided identity authentication records. The system generated a report labeled Extraordinary Anomalies. That label alone changes the tenor of a life. Then the phone call came, not to us but to the school, the local authorities. A government agency, described as special investigatory, reached out about irregularities that suggested either gross fraud or something else. They used words that sounded like they belonged to science fiction: anomalous answer patterning, potential non-human scoring signature. Caleb's score was not merely suspicious. It was outside the envelope the system used for human performance. Our family's carefully curated story began to fissure. The first fissure was a press release from the testing authority placing an investigation on record. People speculated wildly. The journalist who had written that first glowing profile emailed, apologetic and suddenly curious about the audit. Caleb cried, My parents' faces contorted between denial and fear. My father rang every board member he knew. My mother set up damage control interviews. The narrative they loved was unraveling in real time. For me, the moment was paradoxical. My own proof, a number that would open doors, sat there, waiting. The release of my 1589 had already been archived with application systems. My profile was clean. The world would see both results, my near-perfect score and his impossible 1633. The machine of justice would take its course. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that truth had a way of showing up, aided by anonymous algorithms and bored statisticians. I had done my part. I had not broken the law. I had broken the assumptions my family had built their lives on. They called the investigation supernatural in some whispers, because the pattern simply made no sense. But sometimes supernatural is merely a placeholder for something humans haven't yet explained. That night, as the house spun in frantic calls and press statements, I sat on my bed and let the world rattle. The scale had tipped. I had my number. The rest would follow a path I had prepared for. Analysis, verification, the derailing of a narrative built on sentiment. Exposing someone is rarely painless, but sometimes justice arrives as a dataset in a calm voice. And sometimes the small, silent labor of months turns into a lever that can shift an entire house of manufactured mirrors. When I closed my eyes, I saw two envelopes on the table, one for me, one for him. One of them was humanly earned. One of them was an impossible outlier. The world would choose which story to believe, not on sentiment but on evidence. The rest, I thought, would be messy, but that was part of the plan. They came in with clipboards and bureaucratic solemnity, two letters of the alphabet that spelled inevitability. And you, the College Board's audit unit, behaved like a well-oiled machine, dry, professional, and terrifyingly precise. They wanted raw sheets, timestamps, and metadata. They wanted to know whether an impossible number could be birthed by human hands or whether something else had slipped through the seams. When the audit notice arrived at school, the principal's voice trembled like an old speaker trying to preserve dignity and ducking headlines. Rumor vultures circled, and the group chat, always loud, always cruel, erupted into both speculation and support. "Is it a typo?" someone asked. "Maybe an intern," someone else offered, quaint and naive. The internet is always hungry for a glitch and even hungrier for meaning. Caleb handled the first questions like he handled everything, performative vulnerability with a practiced cadence. He welcomed scrutiny because drama breeds pity, pity breeds donations, and donations buy oxygen in our world. My parents issued statements about cooperation and the sanctity of due process. They said gratitude-sounding things in front of camera lights and called donors with the calm of people who think the problem can be polished away with good PR. But the audit was not about PR. The auditors were obsessive. They downloaded the raw digital scan of Caleb's answer sheet and looked at the spacing of his bubbles, the micro-patterns no human ordinarily makes. They cross-checked practice tests, timestamps, and IP addresses from online practice portals. They had tools that made minutiae look like a manifesto, and the manifesto said anomaly. The report, when it arrived, smelled of inevitability. It described clusters of answers that statistically aligned too perfectly with key solution patterns across several test forms. It described response times that suggested instantaneous selection. In plain terms, someone wasn't just extremely good. The data suggested something else was happening, something that didn't fit human rhythms. The phrase that broke our living room like glass was non-human scoring signature. That phrase lives in sci-fi and academic papers. It does not visit suburban families. But it had arrived, and with it came a letter from a government agency that usually lives in the cracks of national security and weirdness. They didn't say supernatural on the record. They said anomalous cognitive signatures consistent with assisted response injection. Translation for laypeople: something or someone had altered the outcome in a way that required containment. A representative visited, formal and clipped, and asked private questions. They were careful, too careful, like people whose job it is to turn oddities into controlled narratives. Caleb began to unravel. The vulnerability he used as armor snapped. It's one thing to perform for donors. It's another to be told your pattern looks like an outlier the machine cannot explain. In private, he sobbed ragged, not for the lie itself, but for the loss of the storyline that had kept him afloat. My parents oscillated between rage and denial, then to bargaining with authorities they both feared and admired. Media smelled blood and circled. Our inbox filled with requests, local anchors, podcasts, a national outlet that liked scandal as much as it liked wonder. The original glowing profile from the blogger pivoted into a new beat: investigation. People like to read about miracles until the miracle requires an explanation. I watched all of this with an odd distillation of feelings. There was a cold, precise satisfaction. My plan to let the numbers do the talking was working. Then there was the human noise, the panic in my mother's calls, the stunned, wrong-headed anger in my father's voice. Revenge is never pure. It's messy and it smells like you for a while. The government agency took Caleb for interviews, though what they meant by interview included clinical observation, questions about his learning history, and later reported in hushed tones. An exam that resembled both cognitive testing and something between a lab exam and an interrogation. Journalists labeled it mysterious. Neighbors called the cars official, and school kids turned rumor into a genre of horror story whispers. I was asked to provide my practice logs. People wanted to know how I became capable of such a high score. My teachers fielded calls. Admissions officers asked about the writing sample I'd submitted. My file was scrutinized with the same hungry curiosity as Caleb, but the attitude was different, less suspicion, more admiration. My 1589 read like a well-researched paradox, immense ability, methodical evidence. It was the kind of thing that fascinated admissions committees and statisticians alike. Inside the battered sanctuary of our kitchen, the dynamics shifted. My parents, who had previously used me as a tool, now saw me as an inconvenient truth. "How did you get so high?" my father demanded once, voice low and furious. "Did you rig it? Did you do something?" He asked it as if I had stolen oxygen from his favorite child. I could have told him in the brutal terms he understood, an evidence dump, logs, annotated practice tests, letters from teachers, metrics. But some truths are better left arranged in the right room. Instead, I smiled, took his plate, and said, "I did the work." It was simple, it was true. It was also a blade. Caleb, meanwhile, lost traction with donors. People don't like rooting for someone being investigated by government agencies, even if the investigation is procedurally neutral. The first major donor withdrew an offer of a scholarship. The board quietly moved money around. My parents made arguments at meetings with voices that cracked like old wood. When the agency presented its preliminary findings, that Caleb's response patterns were inconsistent with known human timing and alignment, they did not make a big public statement. Their language was surgical. "We will be facilitating further study." They took him from our kitchen to a facility that smelled of antiseptic and institutional calm. Seeing him taken in those official cars felt like a slow, liquid unbraiding of the family rope. There was no media show, at first, just formal procedures and the bewildered realization that even someone placed on a pedestal could be removed by systems that cared more for data than sentiment. Our living room felt hollow. My parents' faces were ashen and metallic. They looked not like winners, but like people who had been hoisted on the ropes they'd tied for others. My father's righteous anger curdled into something like fear. My mother moved through food and flowers like a ghost trying to animate a dead thing. In private, I felt a strange emptiness that wasn't satisfaction. The plan had its momentum, yes, but the consequences were real. A brother in custody of a government agency, parents fraying at the edges, donors rescinding trust. I hadn't wanted anyone hurt beyond the exposure of lies. I had wanted clarity, but clarity sometimes comes with collateral damage. Then the emails arrived. Universities wanted to confirm my score. Some called for interviews. MIT's admissions office, yes, MIT, requested an additional writing sample and an interview. My phone vibrated incessantly with checks and congratulations and baffled curiosity. The timing felt absurd. While one brother was being studied for an impossible number, the other had an offer to be considered by one of the most competitive institutions on Earth. The choices ahead were now surgical. I could stay to watch the family car crash in slow motion, try to surgically remove the rot and maybe salvage something. Or I could step out and take the future that was an honest construct of my merit. People think revenge is loud and theatrical, a kitchen scene with shouting and dramatic slamming doors. Real revenge is often quieter, an audit, a report, a data set that unpeels lies. The machine did its work. The consequences were not purely retributive, they were revealing. For better or worse, the truth had become central, and there was no turning that narrative back into glitter. At night I lay awake and listened to my family breathe shallowly in the rooms that once hummed warmth. Revenge can leave a silence in its wake that feels like ash. I told myself, as I had before, that this was not the end of anyone. It was the end of a particular story. We would all have to learn new ones. The press did what press rooms do. They turned a domestic crisis into a morality play. Anchors put the scandal on loop like a particularly salacious candy commercial. Social feeds fired with commentary. The narrative, mystery, deception, privilege fed itself on every retelling. A reporter who'd once sipped champagne at our table now pinged for interviews with gleeful urgency. He's a local hero turned enigma, they said. Cameras that had filmed our donor dinners now trained on our front door, waiting for drama like scavengers. Neighbors took sides with the fanaticism of stadiums. Our name, Mercer, was printed with varying adjectives depending on who had the loudest voice that hour. Caleb's detainment traveled from a clinical phrasing to a tabloid headline in 24 hours. Someone leaked a blurry photo of him at a facility, pale, hair mussed, staring at the camera with the same practiced vulnerability that once won donors. The internet refused nuance. Miracle or monster, someone posted, and the thread cascaded into moral theater. My parents behaved in public like hurricane survivors who believed they could rebuild the beach they had once reshaped. They did not understand that some damage was irreversible. "We will cooperate," my mother told the cameras, voice thin. "We will be transparent." Their words fit snugly into the frame people wanted to see, penitent, cooperative, charitable. But behind closed doors their language was different. Vows of legal battles, calls to PR firms, frantic meetings with the board. Boardroom drama lit up as well. The Mercer family ran a company that traded on trust and networks. Donors and clients feared contamination by scandal. Board members asked awkward, formal questions about conflict of interest and governance. My parents had built an empire on the optics of generosity. Optics rarely survive this kind of cognitive dissonance. Even in this chaos, my own admission possibility gleamed like a narrow tunnel of light. MIT wanted a Zoom interview. A journalist I'd never spoken to before asked for an op-ed about academic integrity and myth. Admissions officers asked for details I had already documented. Their tone was different, professional curiosity, not tawdry spectacle. It felt like a counterweight. Meanwhile, the agency's reports were precise and unromantic. They cataloged anomalies in data and then, somewhat awkwardly to lay readers, suggested a quasi-scientific possibility. Caleb's answer patterns resembled time-compressed response generation beyond typical human reaction windows. The words "unexplained cognitive phenomenon" trended. Conspiracy boards filled with chatter about government cover-ups and psychic powers. I did something I rarely did in the storm. I spoke plainly to the press. Not to trash my family, there was pain and history there, but to frame truth in a way that couldn't be monetized by rumor. I tutored him. I said in a sit-down interview, hands steady. I worked hard. I have logs, teachers, and data. My results are replicable because they were earned through consistent practice. The rest is for the institutions to determine. The interview landed in odd ways. Some praised my candor. Others accused me of using the moment to feather my own nest. The internet trades in snapshots. Context is expensive and rare. What I hadn't expected was the personal price. Old friends sent messages that read like tributes. Other acquaintances dropped off like dead leaves. The human cost of being caught between a brother under investigation and parents trying to maintain a public face is that your social scaffolding becomes unstable. People pick sides, and the ones who love nuance are rare birds. At our board meeting later that week, voices were clipped but barbed. "This is about fiduciary responsibility," one director said. "Clients are nervous. We need a plan." My father's response was a white-hot assault of anger. "We will not let one incident erase decades of work." He sounded like a man whose house was on fire and who chose to shout at the smoke. I did not attend that meeting. I had an interview with MIT. It felt grotesquely convenient, but also necessary. The future can feel like betrayal when your present is a pile of rubble. The agency's subsequent announcement that Caleb would be transferred to a federal research facility for observation landed like a body blow. Observation is a euphemism with cold edges. It reads like safe custody when you want headlines and like institutional care when you want sympathy. In our house, it was both, pity that had teeth. There was a public hearing later where my parents took the stand, framed in the sanctimonious posture that had carried them this far. They spoke of generosity, resilience, and the importance of giving second chances. Behind them, donors and PR people filed statements of support in the tone-deaf way of a generation raised to think optics can be repaired. Caleb's whispered answers from the facility leaked as fragments. "I did what I had to," one snippet said. "They wanted someone to be better." The quote multiplied into multiple interpretations. People parsed it like sermon text. I watched my family fray in public and felt the curious steadiness of someone who'd chosen method over mood. It didn't make me immune to pain. My father's face at night, pale, hollowed by worry and shame, has its own cruelty. It's one thing to have someone you love fail because of folly. It's another to have them unmake you by association. Every time the cameras left our door, new wound-licking gossip took its place. But there were quieter moves beneath the spectacle. Regulators began to look at the company's governance, donors asked for audits, and the board slowly explored succession contingency. The narrative that propped my parents up, of magnanimous benefactors, was being assessed for its sustainability. People don't like investing in stories that smell of unreliability. In a small, private moment late one evening, my mother found me and asked, voice raw, "Will you stay?" She had realized that loss was not a PR problem. It was the slow dissolution of the familiar. She asked because she wanted my loyalty in the only place she thought it would be useful: the company, the brand, the image. I told her the truth. "I can help if you're honest," I said, "but I can't be part of pretending. If you want transparency, I'll work. If you want the old scripts, I can't." Her eyes burned with something between pleading and guilt. She nodded like a woman learning a new language. I didn't know if she would keep that promise, but for the first time in a long while she had asked honestly for help rather than assuming it. The public meltdown had turned private fissures into cracks. The house was not the same. The show had ended. Reality had walked in with a clipboard and read the room. If my parents had a religion, it was optics, appearances as altar, and donors as congregation. When that altar cracked, the people who had built their lives on spectacle flinched. The board, which had tolerated paternal flights of fancy for years, started to whisper about contingency plans, guardrails that would protect the company and its stakeholders from reputational hemorrhage. I sat in on one of those closed-door discussions at my urging. My motives were not purely mercenary. Paradoxically, the more governance tightened, the more likely it was that truth could take a seat in rooms previously reserved for show. I'd grown up watching our company ride public goodwill like a surfboard. If governance could be reoriented toward actual merit and accountability, maybe the place my parents had hurt the most could be restored clean. "Ethan, we need someone operationally competent," an old family friend on the board said plainly. "And we need someone who understands both the numbers and the optics." They were looking at me like a lifeline. The strange negotiation here was not about power alone, it was about restitution. My parents had misallocated influence to a narrative that had almost destroyed both a young man and, nearly, the company. The board wanted stabilization, and the board saw me as a bridge. Bloodline, competence, and crucially, a scorecard of credibility. Possibilities roiled in my head like an angry tide. If I accepted a formal operational role, I could steer governance. I could require transparency. I could restructure the family's influence on the philanthropic arms. It would also mean being tied, publicly, to my parents during their worst hour. Staying might look like complicity. Leaving might look like abandonment. There was a third vector I was now forced to consider: legal leverage. Corporate bylaws have clauses, boring paragraphs that hide switches. If donors and board members lost faith, they could vote to limit family control. It was not hostile, it was procedural and painfully ordinary. The company could realign. My parents would hate it. My parents deserved hate, but governance is not revenge, it's preservation. I began to draw a plan that was surgical rather than spiteful. First step: build alliances within the board by demonstrating data-driven solutions to the PR fallout, transparency dashboards, third-party audits, publications of training materials for beneficiaries. Show metrics and offer independent oversight to rebuild trust. Second step: remove decision-making power from unilateral family control when it came to grants earmarked for special beneficiaries. Third step: adopt a governance charter that required empirically verifiable claims before funds were dispersed. It's bureaucratic and unromantic, but bureaucracy is effective. A company with strong governance prevents theatrical disasters, and for me, governance was a moral preference. It was also a way to neutralize the old narrative engine that had prioritized sentiment over competence. I started small. I interviewed internal people with the kind of precision I used on practice tests. I requested a formal audit of program disbursements. I drafted a governance memo that was boring and surgical and impossible to misunderstand. The board responded with careful interest. Donors liked the rigor. They are, after all, people who prefer predictability in philanthropy. Then came the tricky part: approaching my parents. The dynamic there was blunt. My father took the news like someone handed him a bill he had not expected. "We built this," he said. "We know better than outsiders." His voice carried the brittle arrogance of someone who'd never been asked to prove why. I spoke plainly. "You built something, but you forgot guardrails," I said. "Part of our job is stewardship. If stewardship means changing governance to prevent misuse, then it's a responsibility, not an insult." My mother tried to mediate, but she was splintered between loyalty and a dawning recognition of the damage. I could see it in the way she held herself in the mirror now, less theatrical, more weathered. The board voted to implement a temporary stewardship committee to oversee funds connected to special beneficiaries. That committee needed a chair. There were awkward, whispered suggestions. Then, in a meeting with my father present, a flurry of rational voices proposed a way forward. A family member with credibility and operational competence should be given a formal executive oversight role during the audit period. They didn't have to say my name, but the oblique was clear. I had drawn lines on documents and presented evidence of better ways to manage narratives and funds. They had listened. Their calculus moved in my favor. Being offered responsibility felt like stepping into a paradox. Accepting meant proximity to the people who had hurt me, visible and vulnerable. Declining meant stepping away from power that could be used to stop similar injustices. The board's vote eventually made it simpler. Trust is transactional, and when donors threatened to pull multi-million-dollar gifts, decisions became urgency-driven. I accepted a limited role, oversight on program audits with a mandate to propose a governance charter within 60 days. It was a constrained power, but it was a lever. It allowed me to institute data-driven checks, like verifying beneficiary claims, requiring independent evaluations for program efficacy, and publishing redacted reports to donors. It also created a protocol for investigating claims that, performed honestly, would prevent another story like ours from being spun into public gold. The board responded with cautious optimism. Donors felt better because they could see systems instead of slogans. My parents, predictably, felt like they were being micromanaged by a sensible ghost. The family dinner table entered a new era. We spoke about meetings and bylaws like normal households talk about weather. It was an odd intimacy. At the same time, I kept moving my application machine. MIT required a final confirmation. I had a conditional invitation to their admitted student weekend. It looked ridiculous in the context of our household chaos, but it was also the kind of reality that mattered. It wasn't about fleeing. It was about taking an honest shot at a future I'd built with sweat and evidence. There were threats, anger from my father, quiet pleas from my mother. The company's public face needed stabilizing, and they wanted me to be the salve. I wanted to be helpful, but I would not be a prop. The governance charter draft I prepared was dry and precise. It contained clauses that would prevent unilateral allocations, require transparency, and install an independent audit function. Those clauses ruffled feathers. Old allies felt betrayed. New allies felt secure. The company's future, which had been a high-stakes poker table, moved into the domain of policy. And that's how you take over without theatrics, one checkbox at a time, one clause at a time, until the scaffolding that allowed bad behavior is dismantled. It's not dramatic. It's a series of small, bureaucratic victories that eventually add up to structural change. In the end, it wasn't about vengeance. It was about building an institution that could not be gamed as easily as a family narrative could. And while that might not feel like a cinematic Brazilian melodrama coup, it had a practical, humane aim. Fewer kids like Caleb being used as currency in someone else's conscience. Power is often boring, but sometimes boring saves lives. The house's thermostat seemed to sit perpetually in a state of low simmer. We had become an exhibit that the media loved to pick at: philanthropic family, scandal, supernatural whispers, and a son who had chosen metrics over melodrama. The board's governance reforms, once dry legal clauses, began to look like a moral compass. Donors calmed. Audits published findings. The company, once a PR house of mirrors, started to look like a living institutional entity again. That gloss of institutional stability didn't touch the rawness in our house. My parents argued at times like sharks circling a wounded fish. My father's pride felt both injured and ferocious. He lashed out at anyone who suggested his decisions had been naive. My mother vacillated between shame and brittle defenses. Her identity had always been wrapped in charitable optics, and that fabric had frayed. The agency finally released a statement, clinical and unimaginative, about their findings. They did not use the word supernatural. They did not need to. Their language suggested that Caleb's score had been consistent with what they termed injected response anomalies, and thus they had recommended further observation and restrictions. They spoke of patterns, timestamps, and response signatures without the melodrama the press wanted. Caleb's image, meanwhile, was a mess of competing narratives. There were those who insisted he'd been a victim, manipulated by forces he didn't understand. There were those who thought he had knowingly gamed a system. The truth, where it existed, lived somewhere between both. He wrote to me from the facility, letters that knew how to charm and how to accuse in the same breath. "They're making me a specimen," he wrote in one. "I did what I had to." The phrases were both defensive and performative. I read them as someone who knew how stories were currency. The board, somewhat reluctantly, and with the legal counsel breathing down their necks, moved to change the family's authority. They granted my stewardship role real teeth: an independent audit committee, donor transparency measures, and oversight over any special allocation. My name was on documents now, in a way that made it harder for my parents to treat me as an invisible tool. At the shareholder meeting, I spoke. My voice was steadier than I felt. I laid out the governance charter, the oversight mechanisms, and the ethical rationale. The room was filled with people who had once loved my parents' stories and now wanted to be sure their investment aligned with results, not romance. If we want to be a force for good, I said plainly, we must prioritize accountability. The tragedy here is that we let an appealing narrative override the checks that protect both beneficiaries and the organization. It was not an indictment, at least not framed that way. It was a call to reframe philanthropy as systems, not spectacles. Some applauded, others muttered. My parents sat there like statues trying to breathe. The board voted, and the vote passed. The company would remain in the family's hands, but under stricter governance and with third-party transparency for earmarked funds. Then came legal skirmishes, subpoenas, privacy battles, and lawyers who enjoyed playing chess with injunctions. My parents hired heavy counsel. Donors wrote conditional letters. I counseled for clarity and cooperation. It was a messy season of contracts and public statements, but slowly the legal storm reframed into a bureaucratic calm. Public sentiment mellowed into a more complicated curiosity. Some people felt sorry for my parents. Public humiliation is not pleasant, and some were simply tired of the headline cycle. The company, once bleeding trust, stabilized. Donors returned with conditions. The board did what boards do: they optimized for continuity. Caleb's status did not improve overnight. He remained under observation, and rumors circulated about private findings that leaked selectively to favored reporters. He had the tragic air of someone caught in a social media morality play. I felt guilty sometimes, not because I had pursued truth, but because truth had torn him into pieces. In quieter moments, he sent me messages that were human and raw. He wrote about fear, about nights in a sterile room, about missing the small humiliations of normal life that felt like privilege once you no longer had them. He asked me in one scribbled note if I would come and see him. "Please," he wrote, "not as family, as a person." I went. The facility was clean, and the people there were painfully professional. They asked me questions about practice logs, methods, and timelines. I answered with the precision I'd used for months. They were less interested in drama than in the reproducibility of claims. Behind those closed doors, my evidence felt like currency. Seeing him felt like meeting two people at once: the brother I grew up with and the public person who had been warred against data. He looked thinner than the last time I'd seen him, but there was still that crazy, dazzling charisma in the way he talked. In private, he was smaller and less polished. He asked about the family. He asked about the company. He asked about me. "I didn't plan for all this," he said, voice ragged. "I thought if I let them love me, I'd be safe. I was wrong." "We all make choices," I said. "Some of them are public." There was a moment of real grief between us, not theatrical, not performative. Two brothers holding parts of the same broken map. I wanted to help him in ways I could. I wanted to save him from the narrative that had eaten him, but there are limits to what one can do when systems decide to study you. Outside the facility, quiet things happened. The company instituted training for beneficiaries and enforced verification. Donors liked the new exactness. The board found its feet. I kept my name on operational documents and used that leverage to institutionalize the kind of care I wished we'd shown when things began to crack. Then slowly, the world pivoted. The media had to find another scandal. The agency published a careful report that, while not giving the gossipers the answers they wanted, argued for caution in drawing conclusions from anomalies. It was a bureaucratic anticlimax. something less sensational than the rumor cycle, but more durable. I got my acceptance letter official a few days later. MIT admitted. The letter was quiet in its own way, a small, bright thing that read like a second chance. I packed my bags not in triumph but with a steady sense of need. The world beyond our home felt like oxygen. The reckoning had not been a clean sweep. It had been a messy, necessary excavation. People were bruised. The company reoriented. My family, fractured and raw, tried to find new footing in honest language rather than staged narratives. You don't always get perfect karma. Sometimes you get a board vote, an audit, and a letter that says you are admitted. Sometimes you get both heartbreak and leverage. The two can coexist. And that's the honest part of life. It asks you to carry both simultaneously. Packing felt surreal. I went through my room like a man closing a chapter in a book he had written with both fury and love. MIT's acceptance envelope sat like a tiny talisman on my desk, an invitation, not a vindication, a promise, not a judgment. Outside my window, the Mercer house that had once been a stage felt quieter, as though the lights had been lowered after a long, exhausting play. My parents offered a mixed cocktail of pride and guilt. "We're proud," my mother said when I told her the date I would leave. Her eyes were brimming with something exactly like shame. My father was more complicated. He attempted a handshake that held the awkwardness of someone who still thought in deals and optics. There were apologies, awkward, functional, and sometimes incomplete, and there were silences that said more than disavowals. Caleb sent a short email wishing me luck. It was one of the most honest messages I'd received from him. "Don't let them make you small," he wrote. It was an attempt at solidarity, misplaced and beautiful. The day I left felt like a small, private exodus. Reporters hovered in the distance, their microphones polite but hungry. Board members offered practical goodbyes. Donors came to the airport to shake hands. It felt strange, public grief interleaved with personal freedom. I sat in the plane and watched the countryside recede. Memories unspooled like a film strip. Late nights in the library, the smell of coffee, the ledger of practice tests, the cold clarity of choosing a life built on evidence. The city receded, and the burden of the house slid into the rear view of my life. At MIT, things moved with a different kind of intensity. The lab smelled like curiosity and open questions. People spoke in equations and plans. I found solace in being among other people who prized proof, who asked for evidence before assuming anything. I loved the monotony of study, logical, honest, rigorous. But leaving did not absolve the past. The company's governance remained in my hands for a while. I served as chair for the oversight committee remotely, dialing into meetings between classes. My parents learned, slowly, about the rigorous processes I'd put in place. The company stabilized further under independent scrutiny. Donors came back with careful conditions. The PR machine slowed and the work continued. Caleb's situation evolved too. The agency released him later, not with the triumphant theatrics rumor had promised, but with conditions, monitoring, support, and a stewardship program that required independent verification of any future claims. People wanted closure. The closure was bureaucratic and practical. It didn't make for headlines, but it made for a living arrangement where reality could be measured. There were hard conversations. My father, finally honest, asked if I would consider leading the company one day. He was tentative, like a man who'd been humbled and was learning to ask without entitlement. I told him bluntly what I'd told him months earlier. If we run this institution honestly, if we protect the people it claims to serve, then I'm in. If it's a stage again, then I'm out. He nodded like a penitent. It was small progress. In the months after, the Mercer name stopped trending. Our family dinners moved from choreography to dialogue. My parents attended therapy. Caleb enrolled in a supervised program with clinicians who specialized in cognitive anomalies and reintegration. He was quieter. Sometimes he wrote me long, odd emails about dreams he'd had in sterile rooms. He was not healed. He was not a monster. He was, like the rest of us, a complicated person stitched from choices and circumstances. My first semester at MIT was the kind of humbling, exhilarating experience that rewires you. Hours blurred into the satisfying rhythm of problem sets and late-night collaboration. I loved the work because it was honest labor. I loved how mistakes were gifts to be debugged, not moral failures to be hidden behind narratives. Sometimes, late at night, I thought of the house. I wondered about the cost of truth and whether the scales had actually balanced. I had reclaimed a portion of my life, sure, and the company was better governed. But the family's damage was not something that legislation could fix overnight. Forgiveness is non-linear and slow. It's a 1 foot forward, sometimes 2 steps back process. I kept my phone on for messages from home, and my parents learned to reach out without calculation. A year later, the company's annual report reflected the changes. Donors returned with measured confidence, governance citations read like quiet victories. At a board luncheon, an elder donor raised a glass. "To stewardship," he said. My parents raised their glasses with shaky hands. I raised mine too. There was no triumphant curtain call, no scene where everything resolved like a tidy plot twist. Real life rarely yields that satisfying symmetry. Instead, there were small amendments, contracts revised, people helped with verifiable programs, a brother slowly learning to live outside an enchanted narrative. I was not the same kid who had been shoved into the role of stepping stone. I had chosen a different path, one of evidence, structure, and stubborn honesty. I kept my scorecard in a drawer for a long time, as if its quiet presence could remind me of a period when data did the heavy lifting against sentiment. On a winter afternoon, I received a letter from Caleb. This time it was not performative. He wrote about therapy sessions where he'd learned to separate narratives from facts. He wrote about wanting to study cognitive science, an odd twist maybe, but not surprising for someone who'd lived inside a strange story. He ended simply, "I want to try living honestly now, if you'll have me." I replied that I would. The invitation was not about forgetting. It was about building something different, a family that could be honest without theater and a company that measured claims before funding them. We had lost a lot. We had gained a cleaner road. In the end, the revenge that had started as a personal calculus became something else, a push toward institutions that could withstand sentimental corruption. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't loud. It was 30 clauses, 5 audits, a stolen morning in a sterile facility, and an acceptance letter folded into an old drawer. Revenge had been a catalyst. What followed was repair, slow, bureaucratic, and horribly necessary. We learned to measure things again. And sometimes, when I drove home for a visit, my mother would make lemon cake, and we'd eat it with quiet smiles that had real forgiveness hidden in them, because the world had been messy enough to make newly honest kindness feel like a miracle.